Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 37. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Dr. Joshua Eisenman. Josh is a senior fellow for China Studies at the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C., and an associate professor at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. He co-edited China and the Developing World, Beijing's Strategy for the 21st Century with Ambassador Derek Mitchell, and co-authored a second book, China and Africa, A Century of Engagement. Updating that book, his latest, is on that same theme, China's relations with Africa, a new era of strategic engagement, together again with Ambassador Shinn. Josh, it's a pleasure. Welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. We'd like at the outset to share a little bit about who you are with our audience. Our trick question usually is, when you were asked in elementary school what you wanted to do when you grow up, did you say, I want to be a professor at the University of Notre Dame?
Well, it's funny. I grew up in New York, and in Westchester, we don't have a football team. So the University of Notre Dame really, I thought Notre Dame was in New York a good part of my growing up because, I grew up in a very, Irish Catholic community. And so the University of Notre Dame, it never even occurred to me that I could even attend it as an undergraduate, let alone become a professor there. So when you ask it like that, I have to say that it really tickles me that I ended up, of all places, at Notre Dame because, when I grew up, that was on Channel 4 every day, Notre Dame football.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. So what were the things that sort of drove you through your early years? Were you steering towards international affairs or things China, or was it other areas that you went through before the road bent in this direction?
Well, I think like you, Steve, I pretty early on realized that China is the story of our time and that all other things are important maybe in their own way. But when it comes to what's going to shape the 21st century, the story of China, right or wrong, good or bad, is going to be what's doing it. And so I ended up studying, as luck would have it, under Harry Harding when he was the dean of the Elliott School. And Ed McCord, who was a historian of China. So this was the team leading the Elliott School when I arrived in the year 1990. And it was, amazing, right? China was joining the WTO. It was the high water mark of engagement. You had all these CEOs flying in saying how we're going to trade China into some liberal country, or at least they're going to become our buddy. And this was, as you know, during that period from about then for another decade, engagement and anything other than that was a heresy, right? Yeah. And so, being in Washington as a student at that time, going to then SAIS afterwards and watching this, I quickly became somewhat frustrated with what I saw was a lack of willingness to accept what I thought was plainly obvious. And the frustration, and I know you suffered some of the frustration as well, in trying to explain to people that this was a concern that they should have, and it wasn't wrong to have that concern. And
well,
so
it seems like you definitely stumbled into what a university experience is supposed to be, which is to challenge beliefs and assumptions and have free back and forth. And China policy really wasn't like that for the longest time.
It wasn't. There were really, I think, and you may recall, I would say 3 ideas about China policy that were acceptable at the time. The first was, the engagement will lead to a nicer, friendlier China. Then there was the rickety house, right, that China's many powerful nodes would balance against each other, therefore letting a lot of different ideas in, even if it was a kind of corrupt kleptocracy, which of course we know Xi Jinping then came in and knocked heads. And then of course, the idea that China would collapse, that as a Leninist party, it wasn't long for this world. But at that time, if you had come in and said, we're going to return to the chairman of all things, we're going to return to, one guy who really is exerting authority over the system, I think both Chinese and American, they would have laughed you out the room.
Yeah, my things have changed, but you're right about kind of what the mood music was at the time, for sure. But one of the topics that you've kind of become known for is the intersection of China and Africa. Before we dive more deeply into that, talk a little bit about the before jumping into that pond. You're at university. You're looking at U.S.-China relations at that pivotal time. We go through 9/11 experience that changes everything, but it doesn't change everything, and some other things happen in the world. But what were some of the kind of critical moments where you felt like you were arriving at your own kind of awareness, identity, core assumptions about where you felt you landed on the spectrum of I'm this kind of China watcher, analyst, foreign policy person, what have you? Certainly there was a lot going on then, pulling in different directions.
Yeah, so I took on after graduate school at the U.S. China Commission, the U.S. China Economic Security Review Commission, as an analyst over there, and I was working on hearings. And one of them, ones I did that you can still find on the USCC.gov website today, in 2004, was a 2-day hearing on China in the world. And so it was in that we brought in a bunch of people to talk about this topic, and it really had not been discussed. China in the global south was something from the 70s. It really wasn't something that was hot on the radar, and we actually had a hard time finding people. That's actually how I met Ambassador Shinn. He testified at
Yeah.
that hearing. But it was from there that I began to think about it and began talking to Derek and my friend Eric Heginbotham about the book China in the Developing World. And what we called it China in the Developing World, Beijing Strategy for the 21st Century. And people, I remember Derek at first, he's like, do we really believe that China's strategy for the 21st century is the developing world? And, frankly, I wasn't sure about it, but Xi Jinping made that, I think, very clear. So, in a way, he rendered what we did, to be prophetic. And so working with those great guys and the other authors of that book at a time when nobody was really looking at that topic, and thus allowing me to kind of lead a little bit, as they say, in terms of getting out in front of it, because I was truly interested in the topic. And I saw it gathering increasing interest with the creation of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in 2000 and other of these regional organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the China Arab States Cooperation Organization and others. And so I began to say, hey, there's something's going on here and something's important here. And so just kept pushing on that.
Well, start us on that journey about how to think about and understand China's engagement on the continent. The continent is enormous, and it's very different, top to bottom, east to west. And early narratives can start in any number of places, but you have the People's Republic established under the Communist Party. Of course, there's going to be an ideological kind of tinge to that. But walk us into sort of how it started, and then quickly bring us up to the framing of your books on the nature of that engagement, how it's evolved.
Yeah, so the way to think about China in the developing world or the global south or whatever nomenclature we're using now is that it is a part of China's larger geostrategy, which is predominantly US focused.
Yeah.
So China has a geostrategy. China in the global south is part of that strategy. China in Africa is a subset of China in the global south. So that's the kind of nested Russian doll, the way you can think of it. And thus, there's a lot about China-Africa relations that have a lot to do with U.S.-China relations, even if they're not directly, and those connections are not abundantly obvious. When you look at the structure of China-Africa relations, you could think of it as 4 interlocking layers. At the base layer, the foundational layer, China calls it the base or foundation, are the bilateral relationships. And the bilateral relationships is where sovereignty lies. And that's important to China. So most of the action is taking place on the bilateral level. It's also, it's easy to keep things quiet on the bilateral level because it's just, 2 in the room. Then you have, and it's Africa specific, these sub-regional organizations in Africa, the ECOWAS and COMESA, SADC, and others. So China engages all of these at different levels. It's now building, if it hasn't already completed, the headquarters of ECOWAS. Okay, that's the West African organization. At the regional level, China engages the African Union, and it built and bugged the African Union headquarters. $200 million. They headquarters. They also created FOCAC, the Forum on China-African Cooperation, which is also on this kind of region country engagement. And then, of course, at the global level, at the UN and the IMF and all these other region, a WHO, etc. And we see that it is individuals who move across these layers. So if we take, say, Mr. Tedros, the head of the WHO right now, the health organization, he used to be the foreign minister of Ethiopia. So he began on the bilateral level, transcended himself, and someday, maybe, who knows, maybe he'll join and become part of like the COMESA, and then he'll move himself to another level. But the point is, the relationship that was created with him when he was the foreign minister of Ethiopia is now a kind of existing history that he has with China. And those relationships are something that China pays a lot of attention to. It cultivates them. It considers them an important part of its larger international relations. And so there's a name for this. It's called relationality. I won't bore you with the details of the theory as much as it's to say that this kind of originates with Chinese traditional relationships that date back to the Confucianism and the duties and responsibilities between different partners in a relationship. And these are not, by and large, equal relationships any more than Confucian relationships were. They're asymmetric. And they have asymmetric responsibilities associated with them. So anyway, that's how I would kind of try to answer your question, to think of China-Africa relations in the larger structure and the structure of it and how China thinks of it. Of course, there's a lot of nuance under the hood.
Sure. But if we take another trip on this phase over time and dial in on what was China thinking it's going to get out of these relationships, I think that's evolved in an interesting way too. Because at the outset of a lot of these relationships, China was very underdeveloped. I mean, it had gone through the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, wasn't doing fantastic. It was not a global hub of manufacturing, import-export business. And so in some ways, they go out to the world, including Africa, say, we're one of you, you're one of us. But they probably were looking for some specific things then, too. At another time when relations are up for grabs in the UN, that's a lot of votes at the UN. And I'm sure that there may have been some international political objectives in trying to gather a caucus of votes for them, against resolutions against them. And that probably carries to the current day. But along that theme, how has what China's been seeking in this engagement evolved over the decades?
Well, so the new book we've done is on the Paul Mill relationship, and it's the first of its kind because there's plenty of work on the economic relationship. It's not easy to do that work, but it's not secret, right?
Yeah.
You've worked on in the security world. You know how hard it is to get some of this stuff, and so working with Ambassador Shinn took us 6 years of digging and interviews and all. I mean, God knows what else to get to the bottom of a lot of these questions. And I'm not saying we even got to the bottom. Maybe, we got even halfway. It's even an accomplishment, to be honest with you. But there's one thing I can say, and this is very clear. People ask, how successful is China's engagement in Africa? And to that, I have to say, over the last 10 years, we know of no African country who has contradicted any of China's core national interests. And we know of dozens of countries that have sided with China on its core national interests. You get countries like Rwanda, landlocked African country, announcing that the South China Sea is part of China, right? What dog they have in that fight? Well, their Chinese friends asked them to. Why not? What do they care? So frankly, if you look at it from a pure core interest perspective, for Africans, these are easy giveaways. They don't care about these things. The Chinese care deeply. So from that perspective, China has pushed Taiwan almost completely off the continent. Only Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, recognizes Taiwan, although there are different trade offices that you can find in Nigeria and South Africa, and one in North Africa. I don't recall where. But the upshot is that Taiwan almost completely pushed off the continent. And 10, 20 years ago, they're in the middle of a dollar diplomacy with Taiwan on the continent. Literally bags of money to try to win over the diplomatic recognition of these countries. So from that perspective, quite successful. And I think they've also been quite successful in terms of harnessing this idea that you referenced of kind of a club of fellow sufferers, where they are the leader of the club. And it's very potent in a place like Africa, where people's grandfathers were colonial subjects.
Yeah.
And you come in, it's like confirmation bias, right? You just, you were oppressed. Yeah, you were oppressed. We were oppressed too. And, we got out from under. And let me tell you. Now, is it in the best interest all the time of these countries to just, dance to that tune? I would say not always. Sometimes it's better to have options, and rather than letting those historical enmities fester, I would say not maybe moving past them, but at least recognizing your own interest at this moment rather than dwelling on the past. But China is very good at stoking on these things and reminding them of, ironically, in my opinion, the successes of Maoism, right? The building of the Tanzam Railway and these kind of friendship projects. And so they harness back, they harken back to that kind of, glory days, even if it was, China sending some guns to some rebels, But they do have that history. They do like to reference it. It is a part of almost every major speech that you hear from a Chinese leader. They'll say, the Chinese Communist Party has always had your back, and we will always, right? And the West has always eaten your lunch, and they will always, right? And so it's really, in this way, the global South and Africa become a kind of cudgel in what we sometimes call the new Cold War between the U.S. and China.
Well, if you look at kind of what is being traded or invested in the relationship, in better off parts of the continent, there's the Ahab white whale of everybody wanting to sell to the magical billion Chinese consumers if they would just engage. And so there's some sense of retail or export that is sought. But I guess what has made most news in recent years has really been the infrastructure or mega projects and extractive industries. But can you help kind of clarify, or help us get a good handle on, are there particular areas that that China has focused on in terms of kind of highest priority kind of engagement, and what's been the perception of those things in Africa itself?
It's a great question because it's evolved substantially. I think one point maybe I could start off with is trying to just touch on this, what has become called the debt trap narrative.
Yeah.
And why I'm frustrated with this is because it's yes, it is wrong, and I'll tell you why it's wrong in a minute. But because it's wrong, it has allowed people who want to say that there's nothing to see here to say this is wrong and thus there's nothing to see here. But that's not true. It's not correct, but there is a heck of a lot to see here, and a lot of problems are developing in the debt. So let me explain. To trap suggests intent, suggests that China intentionally set traps which other countries fell into. But having done interviews with Ambassador Shinn at the height of the BRI, I can tell you the goal was always to get repaid. It was to go out, get the contracts, build the infrastructure, get paid back, and get political clout. It was a both and. It was not a let's put ourselves in the hole $1.4 trillion. Ha ha ha. That was not a plan. That was a bad move that they're now regretting, and now we see changes in the BRI because of it. I am so happy, by the way, we did not jump in the BRI. There were a lot of people who were saying, well, we got to get in the game and compete. I remember John Kerry gave some testimony when he was trying to become Secretary of State saying, we got to compete. That would have been the biggest mistake, right? Mm-hmm. When you see your, the other guy shoot himself in the toe, you don't follow him. And we were just for rivalry's sake. There were people saying that, and I was always deeply concerned. I'm glad we didn't go down that road, frankly. But the debt trap narrative is thus incorrect in its statement. That being said, there are a lot of problems here, and there's a lot of debt, right? And part of the problem is COVID, right? But part of the problem is that it is just not possible to do due diligence on every one of these projects and all these jurisdictions and all this. It's just there's too much principal agent dilemma going on, and now they want to make this. They call it the small and beautiful Belt and Road, but
Mm.
you got to do the same due diligence on small projects. You got to do it big, you got to do small. So, frankly, I think that the Belt and Road has been, in my opinion, at this point, a mistake, and they're trying to unwind it, but do so in a politically palatable way because they put it in the Constitution.
Huh.
So we
So
are
you see it
not.
as a mistake from a China point of view. Do Africans see it as a mistake too?
What was funny in 2018 when we were there, they knew that the money was drying up. They were doing everything they could to get, and they weren't wrong. If you look at 2022, I don't think there was any lending from China to Africa. It was like $1 billion. It was like nothing, and it was like 36 just a couple of years ago, and had been unsustainable. But ultimately, they are. It's going to take a very long time to recoup the lending that they put out, not just in Africa, but in other places, particularly places like Argentina and Pakistan. Um, and I do believe the bloom is off the rose, and that, as you know, as everyone knows, you always like your banker when you collect the loan, but paying it back, your feelings may change. And we already see kind of falling, generally speaking. I mean, there are always exceptions, but falling likability for China around the world.
Well, some of that falling likability has been reported internationally from the lens of the local community, workers, what have you. And you know the narrative. The Chinese come in, there's a mega project, but then they bring their labor that doesn't really assimilate, maybe couldn't even assimilate. Locals don't get the jobs they thought they were going to get. Sometimes the quality of the infrastructure project, be it a stadium, a bridge, or whatever, maybe doesn't finish, or it finishes but it cracks, or these things can happen. And I'm not saying that it's all of the projects experience all of these things, but it gets talked about a lot. What can you do to kind of right size that as an impression that people who watch this trend periodically are getting? Is it generally the case, and that feeds kind of the bloom being off the rose for the African side of the equation? Or is it more episodic and it's just different in different places?
Well, I mean, there are 54 African countries, and every one of
Right.
them is unique. And so everyone has its own bilateral relationship with China, its own bilateral debt portfolio. There's only really about 10 or 12 countries, I think, I haven't looked at it recently, that have really serious debt problems with China. The Zambias, Ethiopia, Kenya, right? You've got a handful, not a handful, maybe two handfuls. But that still leaves 40 countries with no debt problems with China, right? So we always have to keep that in mind, that when we say Africa has a debt problem with China, well, sure, Angola might, but what about most other countries? And they don't. So we shouldn't make it an African problem when it's really these dozen countries which have this problem, and they also have it with other debts to other places as well. Um, you know, Here's as I've stepped back and thought about this, let me give you the 50,000 foot here. I
Hmm.
don't know of any instance in history where one country has had another country come in and build their infrastructure and it has led to a successful development model. Do
Hmm.
you?
The only thing that comes close to me is the Japanese occupation of Taiwan, leaving a pretty substantial foundation going forward. But people don't often look at invasion, occupation, colonialism for 50 years as that kind of net positive. But Taiwan has struck me as maybe a place that at least leans in that direction, because there is a lot of the physical infrastructure, even the educational infrastructure, that's a legacy of that era that's continued today, even despite Chiang Kai-shek and the
Yeah.
Mandarin effect. in Taiwan. But generally, in thinking about other colonial experiences, it's usually kind of been extractive and exploitative. And at the end of that, people are happy to have the end of the extraction and exploitation. They're not saying thank you for the roads and bridges. But so
I mean, and the other thing is, those are, as you rightfully point out, colonial experiences. We're not dealing with colonialism here.
right,
We're dealing with maybe mercantilism to some degree, but these are sovereign nations. They hire Chinese firms,
right,
or they take loans from China in order to build this infrastructure. So,
right.
but I know of no instance where a country has essentially outsourced the creation of its infrastructure successfully. Now, and that's setting aside those the colonial instances where it again was often, with the exception of Taiwan, perhaps more extractive. So, and I think one of the reasons is because if you don't build it yourself, how do you maintain it yourself?
Yeah, and
Right.
you're not vested in the long-term quality and function of it.
That's right. And the guy who you bring in to do it, and he's going to go home, and he's not necessarily vested either. So
Yeah,
we've seen things, and the Chinese don't like to say this, but the Tanzan Railway stopped working for a long time. It's not really in great shape now. It never made money. So we'll see how these bigger projects. But China has moved away from them, and
yeah,
they're no longer really. If you want a railway built, I mean, you could hire the Chinese to do it, but I don't think they're in the game of lending money because. I mean, let's face it. There's a reason Amtrak is the way it is, and that's because nobody makes money by investing in basic infrastructure. Right? It's not a money maker in any place.
yeah,
Africa, the Eastern Seaboard, it's just not a moneymaker. It is a public good. All right.
yeah.
And the idea was that coming in and building these public goods, not that the project itself would necessarily generate money, but the increase in GDP caused by the infrastructure would increase the country's wealth and thus allow it to repay the loans. Get
Mhm.
it? So
Yeah,
so it's not that if every project fails, that means it was a failure. Because if you can see enough wealth generation effects in the economy, then you can say that, okay, fine. And when we interviewed the Chinese about this more recently, they did say that yes, and maybe this was wishful thinking. I'll give it to you. I'll let you and the audience decide. But when we were holding our feet to the fire, we said, well, how much non-performance do you have in your loan portfolio? And they kind of, the guy kind of smirked and he's like, according to your Western accounting techniques, there may be X amount, but we have a longer time horizon. We see this as part of a larger relationship. For us, it's not about, how soon can we collect in a business sense. It's about a longer term understanding that infrastructure development is not paying off overnight.
hmm
And maybe we're a little too rosy on that in the beginning, but now we understand that and we've readjusted our expectations. And, I'll leave that to you. I mean, I think there is
yeah,
some validity in that, but it's not entirely convincing either. So,
yeah. Well, let's pivot from looking at the China-Africa kind of coalition there to the U.S. looking into it, jumping into it. You alluded to it a little bit with Secretary Kerry's testimony at one point that kind of poses the question: what does this matter to the United States? What's at stake in China's engagement in Africa? Is it zero sum for the United States? Are there sort of critical things that we miss or will be harmed by, depending on the health or welfare of this China Africa budding cooperation?
so there are a couple of things going on here that directly affect the United States. First, and I did a report for the USIP on this one, it's China's propaganda in Africa. But China's Africa focused propaganda work is very anti US. It specifically targets the United States. And especially after October 7th,
Hmm.
it has done everything it can to, especially in North Africa, to link the United States to the loss of life in Gaza.
Hmm.
And to basically, and so there is the U.S. is the punching bag, and there are the cartoons are pretty funny actually. They have great cartoonists over there, and they've got one really strong kind of guidance, and that is take the pants off the U.S. at a time. And so you can look at the People's Daily, and sometimes it is actually worth a chuckle, and you wonder how much they're investing in just the cartooning alone. But the U.S. has become a target of China's propaganda work in Africa and throughout the global South. And to that end, the idea that U.S. liberal democracy is not successful, and it is a failure, and that that January 6th is part of that idea, that chaos, that American carnage, etc. They've really loved to kind of paint U.S. democracy as chaos, right? And so this idea that the U.S. and liberal democracy are debased. Okay, and this speaks directly to what President Biden talks about when he's talking about this rivalry between liberal democracy and autocracy. China has just built $40 million Julius Nyerere party training school in Tanzania to train African party cadre from around the continent in Chinese governance techniques. They've never done that. I don't know of any country who's ever done that. And the
Yeah.
whole goal is to teach the Chinese governance techniques, to teach the one party autocracy, or worse, right? The totalitarian surveillance state to Africans.
Mhm.
And so, should we care about that? Well, look, during the 1990s, Africa was a place where democracy was on the rise. And now you've got a continent which is the youngest continent in the world. Not every country is young, but it's by and large a very young continent. And you've got an effort to, well, make sure that the United States is a political model is not favored, and that the Chinese political model is. Now, how successful has that been? That's almost a different question. But there's no doubt that they're doing this. And then we can talk a bit if you want about how successful I think it's been. But
Yeah.
ultimately, we are the butt of what they're doing.
So that speaks to information warfare, political warfare, and it would have potentially other follow-on benefits. Of you win that political warfare, it can translate into votes in international bodies that shield you from sanctions or increase sanctions on Israel, the United States, or others, if they're playing this weaponization of information game. I think it is really interesting that they have that hub, because there's a history of American universities in different far-flung areas, but they certainly don't serve that kind of a function. But to see the Chinese step in that way is very, very interesting. The other area that I think makes news and conversation and gets on the Capitol Hill radar is often the extractive industries and rare earths and other things like that. Speak a bit about what the level of national security priority or sensitivity there has been about either encroachment and monopolization, or is that sort of like the Belt and Road, where there was this boom, but worker conditions, environmental conditions, whatever the factors may be, it's not a sort of a permanent one-way trend. It's changing some. Which of those kind of trajectories is that on?
Well, I have to tell you that this is not my specific area of research these days. I've been looking more at the party-to-party relationship, propaganda stuff, the Paul Mill. What I would say about this is that China is and remains deeply interested in African minerals,
Yeah.
in particular. That it has done a pretty good job, as I understand it, of locking up different sites. I'm just not up to date, to be honest with you, on the general trends in the industry. But what I can say is that until recently, it didn't matter all that much, because we didn't have the kind of tense economic relationship we did. And so, if China mined something and then put it in a cell phone or a battery or something, then you and I could buy that thing on Amazon. And it wasn't necessarily harming us that China was able to to get these things because we would then be able to buy them as consumers, your laptops, etc. So, but when we add this economic tension between the U.S. and China, particularly in the EV space, then the procurement of these minerals and these specific rare earths, etc., become more salient in our discussion of national security. So I think that's the most important thing. I have to tell you this, and I'm curious your view on this. But so I was in China with my family this summer, and my boys had been on me to get a Tesla. And then they got a look at some of these Chinese EVs, and they were like, "No, Dad, these are amazing." With the suicide doors and the butterfly doors, and the screen is like 5 times bigger than a Tesla. And so I don't know what the future holds in terms of Chinese EVs in the US market, and I'm not as savvy as many others on the security side of things. But I do believe that as a guy who's never purchased a Chevy or a Ford, that those guys need a kick in the pants. And,
Yeah. Well, I was just in Eastern Europe not that long ago, and there was a lot of concern about the Chinese EV production. That the German big corporations have outsourced a lot of their EV development and production to China, and the traditional production line, the food chain for internal combustion engines, was done by a lot of the Eastern European countries that are neighbors of Germany. And so the sort of leapfrog past their near abroad and outsourcing all of that to China, and then have that subsidized and kind of dumped back into their market was a double whammy. And so there's a controversy playing out there that I wonder may also play out in markets like African continent and Latin America and some other areas where you're going to have, it's sort of the way we experienced Asia not that long ago, and still can in some places. In some places, the primary mode of transportation is the feet, and then it's on a bicycle or a motorcycle. And I don't see a lot of electric motorcycles out there to be deployed in a lot of these developing countries and rural areas. Perhaps they're coming, but there's a lot of talk about cars. In a lot of these countries, there are families that have never afforded a car. And so I'm sure that low cost vehicles coming out of China that could be heavily subsidized, could be a part of that friendship, that long-term infrastructure investment in the relationship, could be a real issue in terms of meeting normal standards for trade. It would not allow for domestic industries to be able to grow and compete in those African countries. And they might care about that at some point. But for the US and companies like Tesla or the other American companies that are trying to get into this space, I think that we're going to have quite the battle about subsidies and fair pricing and is there dumping. But when it comes to the fun gadgets, there's sort of this clash of civilizations going on there. Tesla is more of a minimalist ideal. It's Zen. It's not the sort of Hyundai and Kia of the internal combustion engines that had more of the luxury, the bells and whistles, the high tech. I mean, the first cars I ever ran into that had accurate backup cameras and screens all over the place were Koreans. Now I might be wrong. I probably missed something, and someone that's a car freak like a lot of my family are could correct. But I'm fascinated by the kids' reaction to all of that. But I really, really wonder about how that plays out with the political economy of a continent like Africa, because you know very well you can go to parts of Africa that are very well off, very developed, and can absorb some of these kinds of things. But there's a lot of Africa where people are still working to get their first car, their first reliable vehicle, and the lesson we learn in that transition in the United States and Europe and other places, where are you plugging it in? Because some of these places you still have villages that are mud huts, and you might have a wire that goes in and connects the village and goes out to different houses. you're really going to have the equivalent of a Tesla charging station around for folks? So I mean, I think it's a fun topic, and definitely China seems to be planting a flag, I think, more on the mercantilist dumping side of it. But it's not like Americans have clean hands on it. There are subsidies on buying electric vehicles in the United States. So
No, the electric vehicle situation. I mean, of course, that's not what we're meant to talk here today. But I can just say that as
everything
a
fun is
consumer,
allowed.
I'm not hot to trot, and they go through tires like crazy.
They're
They,
heavy.
that the batteries are made of the worst kind of stuff. I don't know. Like, as far as I'm concerned, I've got a great, Nissan Rogue. I'm going to drive that until, the doors fall off. And then hopefully they've perfected this thing. The hybrid model actually might be the answer,
Yeah.
right? Something that allows you, when you're in the mud hut, you can fill it up with gas. When you're in the city, you charge it.
Yeah.
I think that versatility is the key.
Yeah.
But
Well, particularly how it meets the market culture society in the continent of Africa. Certainly interesting to see where it goes, but it does kind of represent a frontier. Technology, the resources necessary to support a high tech world, or a high tech way of life, and whether your priority is sustainability. For some people, environmentalism means I'd like to have clean air, clean water, and a reliable, resilient supply of resources. Others can mean other things. But it seems very clear, though, that Africa is a bit of a playground for where the titans are going to try to brand themselves and compete. Some of that happens in Latin America too, but there's an interesting part about Africa that I think comes to the fore on that.
Steve, I agree with you, but let me say something that I think is a bit counterintuitive. I have long been deeply concerned, even before Ukraine war, about the closeness of Beijing and Moscow.
Yeah.
And friends at the AFPC, this is a major concern that we've had for many years. And so it's not surprising. But in Africa, things are somewhat different, because I do believe that China would like to see better, more reliable African political parties that it can deal with and make deals with, and that it can rely on and build relations with, that are not going to disappear the next coup. They don't really benefit from this instability. They'd prefer to make a contract, make a deal, get paid back, right? I see them as more kind of proponents of stability, and I see the United States as also proponents of stability and better governance. Now, what we mean by better governance and they mean may well be two different things. But the point is that I don't think the Russians want either type. I think the Russians would prefer chaos. I think they want diamonds and gold. I think that they have no interest in truly. Yeah, they're purely extractive. I mean, so people, and I went to China. I told them this too. I said, your relationship with Russia may be, fantastic in many ways or not. It's depending on what you think. But in Africa, I don't see that you guys want the same thing. And from my perspective, there is room not for U.S.-China cooperation. You see, this has been a long fool's errand. Places, respectable people have wasted a lot of breath on U.S.-China cooperation in Africa. Not going to happen. But what could happen is deconfliction, which means that we should not and have no reason to have proxy wars with China and Africa. We don't have to go when we have a new Cold War, it doesn't have to be like the old Cold War where, like in Angola, the Cubans and the Soviets are on one side and we, and ironically the Chinese, are on the other side fighting in some proxy war in Ethiopia and in South Africa. We don't have to do that with the Chinese. That doesn't have to happen. And I don't see any benefit for either the US or China in getting into any kind of proxy conflicts on the continent. And I think that's a good sign that maybe the next Cold War is not maybe as hot as the last one in that regard. Whereas
at least in that turf.
At least on that turf, right? But again, I don't see the Russians on that. I see them as doing quite a bit of negative.
Well, let's at the conclusion zoom out a bit. You've kind of taken us right to that spot of kind of the final area that gets talked about with regard to Africa, and it may be opportunistic by Moscow and Beijing, but there are the gathering of the BRICS or other things that look to try to create an alternative global financial, strategic, security, what have you, infrastructure in the world that is inherently anti-American, or at least anti the systems that we have championed and invested in around the world. Just as we sort of dial out, what's your take on the African view of that? Is it I would be shocked if it's uniform, but is there kind of a general sense across the continent about what they make of that? Do they feel used? Do they feel welcome? Or is it just sort of another day in paradise for them?
Well, as we've said before, that Africa is a diverse place. So, people are going to have different views. But I think that you mentioned the BRICS. And so that's a good jumping off point then. So the BRICS has just expanded. And in many ways, that's all it ever has done.
Yeah.
The greatest thing it ever did was get bigger. But then you would think to yourself, okay, this whole Red Sea thing is going on. And with the Houthis. And the Chinese are losing money hand over fist. The Egyptians are losing money hand over fist, and they're part of it. And now they are, right? And the Ethiopians are part of it, and the Iranians are part of it, and the Saudis are part of it, and the Indians are part of it, and they're losing money too. So BRICS is literally on the scene, right? They've got the thing surrounded. The Iranians are supporting the Houthis, and it's taken a heavy bite out of Cairo, and so you would think that if there was ever an issue that the BRICS could get together in a room and solve, it would be this. And they haven't been able to do a damn thing. And I don't think they will be, because they are a club of nadering nabobs of negativism. Haters on the U.S. system, people who wish to bring down the rules-based order, as you alluded to. So I don't see them as credible. The idea of a BRICS currency, where would you even put the central bank?
Yeah.
Right? Like, how would you manage monetary supply between Iran and China? I mean, come on.
I think the Chinese have their answer.
That's right, a digital yuan. But the funny thing is, it's really a lot of pie in the sky, and people get very excited about these things. The AIIB, people were very excited, and it's not really taken off in the way. I mean, monetarily, it exists, okay, but it's not really lending a lot of money. And so I think we need to take things with a grain of salt sometimes, especially with regard to these institutions. I don't know.
Maybe that's a great reality check.
Yeah, maybe in a few. I get concerned sometimes that we see what we want to see or what we expect to see. We think the Chinese are 10 feet tall, but they are humans too, and they have mistakes and they have bad policies, and they too have these shortcomings in their political system. So ultimately, who knows? Maybe I'll be eating crow 10 years from now. We'll have another podcast, and the BRICS will be, soaring high.
But the internet is forever, and by then we'll be at episode 12,057 or something like that. But as we move toward the conclusion, Josh, why don't you share with the audience if there's a good place for folks to go to track your work, commentary, whether it's your punditry or books, what have you?
Well, thanks. I mean, I'm a professor at Notre Dame, so you can find my bio and a lot of my work at the University of Notre Dame Keough School of Global Affairs website. My new book is China's Relations with Africa, a New Era of Strategic Engagement with Ambassador Shinn, and that's Columbia University Press. If you want to buy it, CUP20, get yourself 20% off, and it's only $25 anyway. So we pushed the price down. I do work on what we call the China Policy Monitor at the American Foreign Policy Council. That's a weekly kind of summary of China-related events. It's free, comes right to your inbox. So go ahead and sign up for the China Policy Monitor at the AFPC's website. I would say that's it.
Excellent. Well, for our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and a special thank you to Joshua Eisenman for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.